excited because this is actually the first time I've talked about my research. And so also with that, just a disclaimer that I did my field work from June 2015 to September of 2016. And I'm still sort of thinking through my observations. So today I'm going to present some of my findings and the questions I'm thinking through. And if you have any ideas about sort of literature or theories that might be helpful, I'm all ears at the end. And then the other thing I wanted to say is that I have changed the name of the bookstore and people's names just for some anonymity. But I know some people have already recognized it. So without further ado, my talk is Creating a Safe Space, Revolutionary Imagines in the Feminist Bookstore. And I'm going to talk about the way in which a community at a feminist bookstore in New York imagines, cultivates, contests, and experiences a safe space. And before I talk about my own research, I want to just tell you sort of what a safe space is, my first experiences with them, and why I decided to write an ethnography of them. So what is a safer space? So sort of loosely defined, there's spaces that try to be inclusive, supportive, and safe to people from marginalized backgrounds. So this usually means women, queer and trans people, survivors of sexual violence, people with disabilities, for instance. They don't tolerate hate speech or harassment. Safe spaces typically identify as safe spaces, so they'll have a safe space policy outlining some of the guidelines and behaviors they expect of people in the space. They can be a range of spaces, so a bookstore, like where I did my field work, music venues, online forums, but they're often associated with pockets of university campuses and student unions. So some safe spaces prefer to call themselves safer spaces rather than safe spaces, and this was the case with my bookstore. And this is just to acknowledge that no space can be totally safe, but that they can at least work towards being safer. But I will use them interchangeably because they do refer to the same type of spaces. And just quickly, I wanted to mention where safe spaces come from. So they're typically understood as developing from gay and lesbian bars in the mid-60s, where people could sort of be out in good company when they didn't feel safe doing so in public. And the first was first consistently used in the 60s and 70s women's movement, especially referring to consciousness-raising groups, and safety was sort of understood as distance from men. And both of these cases sort of link the idea of safety to having a space for a particular kind of community. So I want to talk about my experiences and how I first discovered what safe spaces were. So have people here heard of country living, out of curiosity? So, okay, I see a couple of nods. So it's a Facebook group that was started by some Oxford students. It's a feminist discussion forum that tries to be a safe space. And I joined in 2014. And I found that by observing what people were talking about, I learned a lot of new vocabularies. So I just included some of the terms that I learned here. So I learned a lot about different gender identities, different sexualities that I'd never heard before, the term white feminism. And I found that I was really being challenged to think about gender and sexuality, and inclusivity of feminism that I hadn't really been forced to think about before. It was a really good experience for me. And then there was an instance at Christchurch. So there was a debate that was supposed to happen between two men. They were both journalists, and it was an abortion debate. And neither of them had any sort of experience with abortion, they weren't doctors, and students wanted it to be canceled. And Christchurch listened, and they decided to cancel it. And they said it was for security and welfare issues. So they were sort of looking out for the mental well-being of the students, and they canceled the debate. But like I said, these were two journalists, and they decided to start writing about safe spaces because they couldn't believe that they had been denied this platform to debate abortion. So Brendan O'Neill, who was one of the journalists, started blaming sort of safe spaces for the reason why his debate got canceled. So here's just some quotes from Brendan O'Neill. To the untrained eye, they seem like your average book-devouring, ideas-discussing, H&M-adorned youth, but anyone who spent more than 5 minutes in their company will know that these students are far more interested in shutting down debate and opening it up. He also says that students shy away from controversy and they're too PC. These were some of his criticisms with this photo. This is what a feminist looks like, these sort of zombie students. And I found that his criticisms were really different from my experiences in country living, because I had been learning new vocabularies, new ways to articulate my opinions. I had been forced to question sort of norms that I had considered just to be normal. So that was sort of my first experience with safe spaces. And then I decided to go to New York to do my field work on a totally different subject at the time. So this was in the spring of 2015. And I was going to work on anti-Zionist Jewish activism, mouthful. But I kept paying attention to these debates about safe spaces because they were happening not just at Oxford, but across the UK and in the US as well. So here's some more criticisms that have been mentioned about safe spaces. So you have Richard Dawkins: a university is not a safe space. If you need a safe space, leave, go home, hug your teddy bear, suck your thumb until ready for university. Quite scathing. There was a letter from the president of University of Chicago to incoming freshmen saying, we don't condone the creation of intellectual safe spaces, and so on. So recurring themes in the media that safety equals comfort, safe spaces restrict free speech, prevent debate, and that students can't handle the real world. And I think this cartoon sort of encapsulates those criticisms quite well. Okay. So, like I said, I was in New York. I was not intending to research the subject, but I started hanging out at pocketbooks, which I discovered online because I was looking for a feminist bookstore. And I immediately felt sort of an affinity for this space. I bought Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology by David Graeber, which opened up a lot of new ideas to me and I thought was really inspirational. And just the bookshelves were really interesting. So they had a queer studies section, a post-colonial fiction section, anarchism, police and prisons, and I was just really inspired by the books. And the people were really friendly, and so I just started hanging out in the space more. And the more I learned, the more intrigued I was. So it's 100% collectively and volunteer run. They have a mission statement, and I found out that they were also a safer space. And I just wanted to share what the mission statement was when I first arrived. It's quite long, but the important part is they say that we actively support movements that challenge hierarchy and all systems of oppression, including but not limited to, they list some patriarchy, heterosexism, the gender binary. And so I was really inspired. And then sort of the anthropologist in me sort of realized, you know, I'm hearing all of these things about safe spaces that don't correspond to my experiences. I mean, anthropology is very well poised to study something from the ground up and challenge a lot of assumptions about spaces. So I asked my supervisor if I could change topics. Unfortunately, he was flexible, so I changed topics. So the main question that I'm just trying to answer is how does the community at Pocketbooks, a feminist bookstore in New York, imagine, cultivate, contest, and experience the store as a safe space, ideologically, spatially, and socially? And what I'm going to talk about today is the history of the store. I think giving a context is really important because we often talk about safe spaces as something new, but it's important to see how a space is developed into becoming an explicit safe space. Then I want to talk about the policy itself and how people sort of imagine safety, and then how they turn these ideas about safety into practice, how they negotiate those practices, and then how people sort of experience safety. So for whom is the bookstore actually safe? And like I said, I'm still looking for sort of theories and literature, but a couple of inspirations. I've already mentioned David Graeber, his book I bought at the store, and he stresses how anthropology can really shed light on anarchist spaces and radical spaces, and how anthropology should do more of that. So I'm sort of taking him up on that. I've also been inspired by a book I started reading called Contesting Public's Feminism, Activism, and Ethnography by Lynn Phillips and Sally Cole. And they write how feminist spaces can open up new room for women's participation, but they can also create new silences. And so looking at both how women's spaces or feminist spaces include high school people. So I'm going to focus on that. And then lastly, another book that I got from the bookstore called The Feminist Bookstore Movement by Kristen Hogan. And this was also really useful for seeing bookstores as more than a place that sells books, but a place that sort of differs both in structure and purpose. Okay, so my methodology. So participant observation. I was, I'd say, very heavily a participant in this space. So I started off as a volunteer, and then I became a staffer, which is basically a volunteer who had a 6-hour shift a week. I was a key holder, and I was also invited to meetings with staffers and the collective members, and the collective members were the group who owned the store. I conducted interviews. I became involved in project work with the store, so cafe stuff, writing a staffer agreement, planning forums, and I attended in-store events because they had events almost every day. I should say, so the bookshelves were on wheels, and you could sort of wheel them out, and then you could attend events in the center. And then just briefly, being a feminist and being a researcher, I read a good quote about this, just how it creates both an insider and outsider dynamic, and how this sort of, as someone said, allows a unique opportunity to critically reflect on this activism. This was Erica, which I want to say, Dlugatch, and this was in Contesting Publics, that I mentioned earlier. So coming in with sort of a sympathetic understanding of what they're trying to achieve, but also being critical and not letting go of that either. And then just being aware of my own identities and privileges. So I will say that I was very similar to most of the community in the bookstore. They tended to be university students or recent graduates. Obviously, I'm a student. It was predominantly white people, but not to erase people of color in the space. A lot of women, and so I sort of fit in. But I will touch upon this point later about whether my identities created exclusion that the store didn't want to happen. Okay, so let's talk about the history now. And again, this is important just to see how the safe space developed from something and just not out of thin air. So Pocketbooks opened in 1999 as Pocketbooks Women's Bookstore. It was run by a women's only collective, and it was faithful to sort of the 1970s women's movement. They had a lot of books on lesbian and gay culture, and they were affectionately referred to as a lesbian bookstore at the time. I have their mission statement, but basically they were saying that they wanted to create a space for women, make it a community space. So that was when it first opened. And then in 2002, 2003, the store was feeling a lot of economic pressure. And this came in part from 9/11, so sales in New York were down in general, and also both Amazon and Barnes & Noble, which caused a lot of independent and feminist bookstores to close. So the collective disbanded at this point, and the woman who originally opened the store tried to take over briefly by herself, and then she decided to leave to go to business school. And then, so what happened next? This is sort of recounted as legend, so I'm not exactly sure if this is 100% true, but I'm told on the very day that the doors were shutting, a woman came in and she stopped it and she bought the store on the day it was closing. I don't know if that's true. But around that time, a woman came in and she bought it. And she decided to assemble a new collective. It was a 6-person collective, and it included men. And she changed the name of the bookstore to Pocketbooks Radical Bookstore, and they literally painted over the awning to rename it. And they included broader social justice issues. So this was reflected in the mission statement, which I showed earlier. This was written in 2003. And also the books reflected these broader themes as well. In 2005, the store was doing well, so they expanded into the space next door. And again, I'm told very DIY style. They literally, volunteers were knocking the wall over and they did it themselves. And then again, economic pressures in 2008 with the financial crisis. So the collective soon realized that the store was going to run out of money. And so they made a really difficult decision in order to help the space survive. So they decided to stop accepting pay for their work. So it would now be an unpaid collective. And this meant that the volunteer base at the store grew. So instead of having collective members in store on shift all the time, they sort of just handled financial issues and book buying, but volunteers would be in the space more often. And then it turned out to be a good decision because the store has survived. And everyone has stayed unpaid since then, I should say. In 2011, they hosted their space to protesters from Occupy Wall Street, so they gave them free coffee, and that invited new people into the space, and they ended up becoming volunteers, some of them. Then in 2014, after Eric Garner was murdered by the police, there were a lot of Black Lives Matter protests, and again, the space sort of hosted the space for those movements, and they made signs and they would march to protests. So let's talk about pocketbooks today, or at least when I arrived to do my fieldwork in 2015. So when I arrived, they signed a new 5-year lease. The neighborhood had been gentrifying and rents went up, I should say, with that lease, and they ran a fundraiser to help them stay in the space. So now the structure is they have a collective, which is between 3 and 7 people. It rotates a lot. Staffers between 15 and 25, who have their volunteers with longer shifts, basically. Volunteers between 60 and 80 who have 3-hour shifts. And the idea is that this is meant to be a non-hierarchical structure, and seen as different levels of responsibility and commitment to the store, rather than sort of hierarchical tiers. But this was a big source of debate in the store, I should say. Like I said, most people were between 18 and 30 university students. It was a very queer-friendly space. I would say the majority of volunteers would consider themselves queer. In terms of the type of feminism, they really try to be an intersectional feminist space. So looking at multiple forms of oppression. They're very explicitly trans-affirming and sex-positive. And they're careful to not call themselves a radical feminist bookstore because that has sort of connotations of trans-exclusion. They have cafe areas still. They have $1 Zapatista coffee, vegan treats, events almost daily. So this includes a dyke knitting circle, which has been around since the store opened. They have a women and trans mic night, self-defense workshops, book readings, all sorts of things. It's a safer space, and it has been since 2012, 2013, which I'll get to in a minute. It's open from 11 a.m. to 11 p.m., and it's a sober space. And this is pretty significant in the neighborhood now, because it's basically full of bars. And I think this history is really interesting because it's shown sort of the store's ability to survive and adapt over time, and really react to economic pressures and find creative ways to respond to that. And I think that's really important. And as one person said, this is a collective member, we sell books to host a space. And so her point was just that what the community makes of the space is of primary importance rather than just selling books and making money. Okay, so I want to talk about the safer space policy now. So a collective member proposed this in 2012, and then it was posted online in 2013, linked from the mission statement, and it's been in the store since 2014. And it really is impossible to miss the fact that pocketbooks is a safer space. So on the door before you walk in, it says we are a safer space. When you want to volunteer at the volunteer orientation, everyone reads through the policy together and you have to agree to uphold it in order to volunteer. And it's really the only rule you have to follow. So it's okay if you're a volunteer and you make a mistake at the register, not a big deal. But if you don't uphold the safer spaces policy, that's a problem. And I will go through the policy, but it is quite long. So I don't want to dwell on every word in there. And also, it's not so much about sort of an explicit rule and rule breaking and rule following, it's more sort of the spirit of what's in there. But nevertheless. So I put some things in blue that were important. That's my doing. So they're trying to create a supportive, non-threatening environment, being proactive in creating an atmosphere where the safety of others is validated, And then they list what they consider oppressive behavior, which is synonymous for them as violent behavior. And this is anything that demeans, marginalizes, rejects, threatens, or harms anyone on the basis of, there's a very long list, ability, activist experience, age, cultural background, education, ethnicity, gender, and so on. And then in the next part of the policy, they talk about some behaviors and guidelines that expect of people. So a few important ones would be to respect people's identities and backgrounds, including names and pronouns. Don't make assumptions about people's identities. Respect physical and emotional boundaries. And they say this by checking in with trigger warnings, which I'll talk about in a second. Be aware of your prejudices and privileges. And again, no alcohol, unless pre-approved. And just at the end, they can ask you to leave, basically, is what that says. So I just want to talk a little bit about how they conceptualize safety, both from the Safer Spaces policy and from talking to people. So this was already in the policy, but basically, it's not just being free from physical violence, but just anything that could harm you mentally or emotionally as well. And respect for people's boundaries. And I want to talk a little bit about why it became a safer space, because I think this also sheds some light on what it needs to be one. So the person who proposed the safer space policy in the first place isn't a part of the store anymore, and despite my best efforts, I can't get a hold of them, which is frustrating. But I did talk to someone who has been around since the store first opened, and she grew up in New York. And she was telling me that she really missed her gay neighborhood, and she was referring to the East Village and Lower East Side, which is where this bookstore is located. And she was saying, so she's gay, and growing up it was her space, but now if she walks in that area holding her girlfriend's hand, she will get looks, and she feels like an outsider there. And she said, this neighborhood used to be my safe space. And I said, what do you mean it was your safe space? And she said, don't get me wrong, you were never physically safe. You were never physically safe anywhere to be out and be gay. But if someone looked at you a certain way, or if they said something to you, they were in the wrong, because it was our space, it was our territory, and we were the insiders. And she said, you knew that someone would have your back. And I think this is interesting for a few reasons. First of all, it's suggesting again that safety is more than just free from physical harm, but about whose space, whose norms and practices. And also this idea that the need for an explicit policy came at a time when there was sort of a loss of radical spaces or a loss of gay spaces. And in terms of loss as well, this was reiterated by some of the older people I spoke to who had been around the store since it opened. They also said that the neighborhood has changed so much and that they feel like they've lost something. And lost of feminist bookstores too. I think there's only a dozen in the US where there used to be over 100. So now I want to talk a little bit about how they take these ideas about safety and try to put them into practice. So just a couple of examples. So gender pronouns. So if I were to introduce myself at Pocketbooks, I would say, hi, I'm Rachel. My pronouns are she, her. And this is the idea so that you don't just look at someone, assume their gender, and then make an assumption about what pronouns to use. And we did this when we introduced ourselves or before meetings. And you even do this in meetings, even when you know everyone, just in case someone is now using new pronouns. And you don't want to assume that they're still using what they were before. If you don't know someone's pronouns, you use they, them, which is considered gender neutral, and sort of the safest bet. And this was sort of seen as a practice that sort of interrupts what you might want to call sort of everyday violence against trans and gender non-conforming people, and changing the practice around that. Another thing would be consent. So there was a lot of attention to consent. I'll talk about sort of physical consent. So one of the times this first came to mind was I was getting some drinks with some of my friends from the space, and afterwards, instead of just hugging each other goodbye, my friend said, what do you think about hugs? Would you like one? Are you okay with hugs? And I was like, you're asking me if you could hug me? I'm not used to this. Normally, if you're friends, you just hug and you say goodbye. So that was the first instance. The second instance was I was taking a self-defense workshop in the bookstore, and it was the case where I expected the instructor to touch me because it was a contact class. But even before touching me, she said, is it okay if I touch you? So this sort of hyper-awareness of other people's physical boundaries and paying extra attention to that. Trigger warnings. So this is something that's been written about a lot and I could talk about forever. But basically the idea was if you're going to talk about something sensitive, to just sort of warn someone beforehand. So if you're going to talk about something that includes rape, you just say, before I talk about this, I just wanted to let you know that I'll be discussing sensitive experiences about rape. And that would normally include just a sentence that it's okay to leave at any time, no questions asked. And this is sort of seen as respecting people's emotional boundaries and giving people space. And then, speaking from personal experience, and this idea that you can get the most knowledge by people who have actually experienced something rather than being an outsider looking in. Compassion, respect, non-judgment. This is also something I can say a lot about. But there was really this idea that you should have as much compassion and respect for people in this space as possible and be as non-judgmental as possible. So I experienced this a few times. The first was kind of embarrassing. So I took a couple of these self-defense classes at the bookstore. And one of the times it was winter, I'm asthmatic in the winter, and I just wasn't prepared for how difficult it was going to be. And I nearly fainted in this class. And this was early on in Fieldwork days, I didn't really know people. Absolutely humiliated. And they just took me over, sat me in the corner, and they were like, what can we do for you? Can we get you some coffee? Can we get you some food? So they gave me coffee, they brought me a cookie, and just sat me down, and we just chatted for the rest of the hour. And that was sort of the first instance of compassion that I had received in the bookstore. And similarly, when I was in the hospital for another point, I had some medical issues, and I was overwhelmed by the amount of messages I had gotten from people. And they were always saying, what can we do for you? What are your needs? And it was never sort of trying to help me by the way that they thought was useful, but sort of considering my own needs first. And I thought that was really important. And then vulnerability, courage, creativity, and confrontation. So one of the criticisms of safe spaces was that people sort of shy away from scary ideas. But I just found that this wasn't the case at all. And this first really hit me. There was a reporter from the New York Times. They were writing an article about the space, and there was an event going on. And a woman who was giving this presentation, she stood up and she said, I am a survivor of sexual violence. And she then proceeded to talk about her experiences with sexual violence. And for me, this had become pretty normal. I was used to these kind of discussions in the store. But this reporter just could not believe that someone just got up in front of a crowd of people and said that they had survived sexual violence. And I mention this because I think pocketbooks, through these practices and compassion, created a space where people felt secure enough to really confront difficult issues and be vulnerable in talking about their experiences. And I thought that was really admirable. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that. And like I said, so these were sort of creating practices and norms and vocabularies that disrupt maybe sort of everyday violence. And this also forced people to really reflect on practices that they would consider normal. So someone said that they had never thought about pronouns before, but being in this space really made them think about how their own practices might be hurting people unintentionally. And so then this sort of involved the process of unlearning sort of social norms and relearning new ones, and sort of new ways of relating to one another. So now I want to talk a little bit about sort of negotiating space safety and practices. So I've mentioned some of the practices, but there were always conversations about how do we make this space safer, how do we make our practices safer. And people didn't always agree. There were a lot of debates and disagreements about how to do that. And again, I want to talk about these sort of processes and discussions that people had, especially to address this concern that people in safe spaces don't ever disagree with each other, they don't like to challenge one another. So I want to talk about a few discussions about safety and practices where something was resolved and there was a change, and other questions that were sort of left open about how to make the space safer. So the first example I'll talk about is just with bookshelves. So when I first came to the store, there was a section called Violence Against Women. And I remember in the sort of early days of my time there, when we were talking, I was talking to people about what they thought of the different bookshelves. And this kept coming up that they were uncomfortable with the section called Violence Against Women. And the reason that kept popping up was that they felt it was a bit too exclusive because violence happens to more people than just women. And violence happens even more so if you're at multiple intersections. But that shelf didn't really acknowledge that with that title. So the collective heard what people had been saying, and they made the decision to change the title of the book section to Violence and Trauma. And they did this in the name of inclusivity and safety. And they also made a decision to move where the bookshelf was. So originally it was sort of when you came into the bookstore near the cafe area and also near the children's area. But there would be some books that had rape in the title, and they felt that it would be safer to move it somewhere slightly less visible. So they ended up moving it. So safety in that sense was also created not just sort of through practices, but the use of the space, the physical space of the store. And I thought that one was really interesting. Another shelf that got changed was women's studies, and I was talking to some people about this actually before the presentation about how names evolve. So there used to be a women's studies section, and this got changed to feminisms when I was there. And the reason for that was just that women's studies sort of has second wave connotations, and they felt that they wanted to develop, I guess, from there. And they also wanted to acknowledge that there wasn't just one type of feminism, but there were multiple types, so feminisms could incorporate that. So those were some of the changes. Bookshelves. Do I have time to talk about this? Okay, so just quickly, books that don't belong. Oh, I'm forgetting the title of the book now. The point was there was a book about sex work. And some sex workers tweeted actually at the bookstore saying, how can you have this book? This book is really unsafe. And it made sex workers feel really uncomfortable with the space. And so the collective made the decision to remove the book from the store. And that was sort of a practice of community accountability as well. So they changed that in the name of safety as well. So I've mentioned pronouns. I just want to complicate this a little bit more in terms of something that was discussed and never fully resolved. So it was normally considered okay to ask for someone's name and pronouns. But I did this once. I introduced myself and I said, what's your name and what are your pronouns? And the person got really flustered. And they started saying, I don't know, like I don't know about my gender, I'm confused, and I felt terrible because I tried to make space for them and be understanding, and I clearly put them on the spot. And I was just like, and this sort of started a conversation about whether it's okay to ask for pronouns or not. And this, again, was never fully resolved because some people said, yes, it's okay to ask. It's the same as asking someone for their name, so you don't misgender someone. And then someone who was trans said that they preferred if someone introduces themselves with their name and pronouns, and that sort of opens the space for the other person to do the same, but it's not forcing them to do it. And that sort of became the practice that I adopted, because that sounded good to me. There's more I can say about pronouns if people are curious, but I'm going to move on. So another question was about drugs and safety. So a few volunteers found needles in the bathroom. So there was a bathroom that was open to the public, really anyone could use it, you didn't have to be a customer. And the volunteers had some idea of who they thought it was, but it kept happening. And this was obviously a safety concern to have used needles just chilling in the bathroom of the bookstore. So they invited the Harm Reduction Center to come into Pocketbooks and do a little event with us. And so they trained us. So they trained us to recognize opiate overdose, and then they trained us in how to use Narcan, which is basically a drug that'll stop the effects of opiates. And it can't cause harm if someone has an overdose, it can only help someone. So they trained us in that, and that was one way that we tried to make the space safer in case someone had overdosed. But there was a debate also about what to do with the needles, and these are our bathroom as well. Because having this public bathroom was seen as an accessibility issue. We wanted to be a space where people didn't feel like you had to be a paying customer to use the toilet, because it's really hard to find bathrooms sometimes in New York. And so we considered it an accessibility issue. We wanted to make it available, but at the same time, we obviously didn't want it to just become infested with needles. So they suggested that we could use a sharps box, which is basically a medical safety box where people can safely dispose of needles. And this started up another debate with whether that would make the bathroom in the bookstore safer or whether it would invite more drug use. This was never resolved. As far as I know, the box didn't get put in, but we had it, we just didn't actually install it. Maybe that'll change, I'm not sure. Another debate would be whether the involvement of men in the space. So this came up a few times. And again, whether you need to include men to sort of reach these goals and make them safer or not. And this came up with someone wanted to start a feminist masculinity shelf and have books dedicated to men. A lot of people did not like that. They felt like men have everywhere, basically. Everywhere belongs to men. We need a space that's not for men. It ended up getting put in anyway, actually. But yeah, like I said, a lot of people weren't happy about that. And again, I just wanted to share these with you just to show that these were always ongoing processes that weren't sort of stagnant. There wasn't sort of one rule that was always followed. They were a conversation, and often heavily debated as well. Okay, so now I want to talk about safety for whom, and I want to give some examples of people that I found in the bookstore and talk about inclusion and exclusion. Because the whole idea of the bookstore was that we want to be safe for people who experience oppression. That's really the whole point of having this policy in the first place. And I guess you could sort of measure success based on whether they're including people or not. So I'm going to talk about, start with two people who really seem to embody this kind of inclusion that the store was after. So the first I'll call Lee. So Lee is a trans teenager. He's mixed race, mentally ill, and a survivor. And these were all identities that he told me, and obviously that's quite heavy. And he told me that Pocketbooks, so he first came to Pocketbooks in high school. He was an intern in the space, and he said that this was the only place that used his correct pronouns except for Tumblr, which is like an internet blog. He said that his family wasn't accepting of him. He didn't feel safe at home. He said he didn't feel safe at school. And that school kept sending him the message that he was a failure, he couldn't achieve anything. And then he came to Pocketbooks and found people who invited him into their homes. He celebrated Thanksgiving with some of them. And they also gave him responsibilities in the store. And he said that this was sort of the first time he felt like he could actually do something and he would be trusted to have some responsibilities. And then he actually became a collective member when I was volunteering there. So really having a lot of daily responsibilities in the store. So I would consider that sort of a success, I suppose. And he said he wouldn't have survived high school, he thought, without Pocketbooks. Another person sort of echoed some of these thoughts. So I'll call her Stacy. She was trans, and she was also a drug addict. And I didn't actually know this until I was doing an interview with her, and she just told me, which also goes back to creating a safe space so people can talk about vulnerable things. But anyway, she told me that this was the only place she knew she could go and she could be sober. Because like I said, it was open from 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. and it was a sober space. So she knew she could go there for those hours without using drugs, but she didn't know that would be true if she were elsewhere. And she said, with that though, she knew that being a drug addict wouldn't actually affect the way people treated her in the space. So even if people knew that, she would still be given responsibilities. So that sort of echoed what Lee had said about being given responsibilities and being trusted and then feeling empowered because of that. And she said she felt positive about contributing something to the space. So these are sort of two examples where the safe space policy and making a safe space really worked toward inclusion. But this wasn't always the case. And so I want to sort of consider whether sometimes having this policy excluded people as well. So the example I'll give, I'll call him Basil. Basil was homeless, he was queer, he was disabled. And he used to hang out in the cafe area and he would paint, to sort of mind his own business. And he started leaving his artwork in a little bin in the store overnight. And the collective and the staffers asked him to please not leave his stuff in the store overnight because, well, we had a lot of resources to offer, we couldn't offer sort of storage. Okay. He didn't listen, and he kept leaving his stuff. And the collective emailed everyone saying, if this person leaves their stuff in the store, please leave it outside. And they said their reason for this was that it was a safety issue for volunteers, that this would set a precedent. So this was the case where sort of the language of safety was being used against someone vulnerable. And what ended up happening was a volunteer left it out with the trash. And I thought this was devastating. Several of my friends who were volunteers also thought this was absolutely devastating and wrong. I had two friends who worked with this person to go through sort of homeless resources and try to help them out. But they felt like the store had let them down and sort of manipulated the use of safety to exclude someone that was meant to be there. My friend said, if we can't provide a space for someone like Basil, then who are we providing a space for? And this sort of gets you thinking about whether the space ever sort of purified itself in the name of safety in the way that cities will use gentrification, in the name of safety, let's clear this area out in the name of safety. And then another thing that came up, someone who was autistic, she said that she was worried sometimes that because she couldn't pick up on social cues, that she would struggle to sort of follow these rules and use this language. And people reassured her that this wasn't the case and we wanted it to be a space for her, but she was still really nervous about this. And that also just got me thinking about who can sort of learn this language, who can learn these practices, and who feels comfortable doing so. And like I mentioned earlier, when I sort of looked at the people in the space and who spent a lot of time there were obviously a lot of people who experienced depression, like I said, trans, mentally ill, survivors, and so on. But it was still a predominantly university educated space. Most people went to college. It was more white than sort of people of color friendly. And so those observations just got me thinking about whether these practices of safety do include everyone or if they create sort of new exclusions and new forms of injustice as well. So these are some other themes I'm going to address, hopefully in my dissertation, but I'm going to just sort of leave them for now. But so debates on hierarchy. So there was a lot of internal conflict when I was there about hierarchy in the space and whether some hierarchy is needed to ensure and regulate safety, or if having hierarchy automatically makes the space unsafe. That was a big debate, lots of conflict. And then talking about what hierarchies I thought emerged the absence of an explicitly defined hierarchy, as well as ways people try to subvert them. And then what it means to sort of be a revolutionary in a capitalist, sexist, racist, and moral world. So the tensions of being both anti-capitalist and a business, and thinking about the ways oppressive structures come into the space as well, and how people respond to them. So those are things I want to get to at some point, but I knew I wouldn't be able to get to today. And lastly, I just sort of wanted to end on a note of hope. And this comes from, I was doing an interview in the store, and the person I was talking to, we were talking about a lot of the nitty-gritty things in the store, things we were disappointed with, a lot of this internal conflict I sort of mentioned. And we were getting a little bit down about the space. And a woman was sitting next to us, and she listened, and she said, "Don't forget to mention something about hope. Don't forget to mention something about inspiration." And I asked, "What do you mean?" And I got to talking to her and actually interviewed her. And she said, you walk in here and you're immediately inspired. She said, "Look at all of the people who are so dedicated and spend so much time helping this space and community survive." And she told me she had actually been a student of Audre Lorde's, and she had been coming to the store since it opened. And she said she had seen it change a lot. So she said back in the day, there were no books for women of color, and now there are shelves full. And she was really encouraged by this as a woman of color. And I want to end on this note because I think it's really easy for us to sort of look at the present and towards the unknown future and forget to sort of look in reverse and see how far we've traveled. And I think pocketbooks is an example of sort of survival and the fact that change is possible as well. And I want to sort of end with this quote by Rebecca Solnit, which comes from her book called Hope in the Dark. And this was a book that got circulated quite a bit in the bookstore, especially when things were tense and people were feeling a bit down about the space. And it's just about the importance of having hope for a better future and sort of an alternative feminist present and future. And it's just, hope just means another world might be possible, not promised, not guaranteed. Hope calls for action. Action is impossible without hope.